LaMelo Ball, at the ripe old age of 18, has been in the headlines for some ridiculous things. He committed to the UCLA basketball team as a 13-year-old alongside his two older brothers that he'd already consistently played games with. Then, a few years later, with Chino Hills after their record-breaking season, he put up 92 points in a game as a sophomore. And also that crazy half-court shot that had kids pointing at the line for at least a year after. I did it too, I'm not gonna cap. Then, of course, he quit high school to go play professionally as a 16-year-old in Lithuania, had his own signature shoe launched, and then left the league because the coach had issues with the Ball brothers demanding more minutes. And then he joined the Junior Basketball Association, a league created by his father, LaVar Ball, to literally market his sons. After that, of course, he left there to go play high school ball again for the Spire Institute, a world-class youth Olympic training academy, to finish out his high school career. And then got to the point where teams would bail out on playing them because they didn't want to lose their own college eligibility, playing against a professional, which he was at that point. Now, after all that, he went to sign with Australia's National Basketball League, becoming a professional once again, this time in a more proper way, through their Next Stars program, which we'll talk more about later on. From there, he averaged 17 points, 7 assists, and 7 rebounds over 12 games before getting injured, which was enough to win him Rookie of the Year and ensure that he's at the very least a top 5 pick, if not top 3 or maybe even top 1. Which leads us to here. Among all the turmoil in the world going on right now, LaMelo and his manager Jermaine Jackson have declared that they're buying the Illawarra Hawks, the team Melo just played for, and essentially becoming its owners. We've seen so many of these crazy headlines from the Ball family before concerning all three of them, from the China incident to the ZO2s to that little WWE slip. But this is one of the craziest that we've ever seen. We know that the Ball family is all for sensational headlines, but this one isn't necessarily as radical as you may think. Instead of it being a master plan that LaVar and his team cranked out as a part of this huge basketball revolution, it's a trend that the league in Australia, the NBL, has encouraged strongly. The statement LaMelo Ball is the owner of a professional basketball team is crazy enough in itself, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Now, it might not be as shocking as when it's broken down, but it's actually more interesting. It's not LaMelo coming in to save the team in a stroke of genius and compassion or something like that, but rather a partnership between the Australian National Basketball League and LaMelo's team to create a relationship for both parties to benefit. Now, to talk about why, we're going to require some context. The NBL is one of Australia's most popular sports leagues. If you haven't heard, basketball is Australia's, and the world actually I might add, most second popular sports. According to a survey conducted in 2014, approximately 1 in 3 Australian children play basketball in an organized fashion. This popularity stemmed from thousands of fans watching basketball in the 1990s.
You can make my day if you say good day, mate.
With Australian NBL legends inspiring the youth, of which turned into the 10 or so Australian players in the NBA today. In terms of quality of play, they possess about a dozen or so of the world's best teams outside of the NBA. If you guys remember, actually, the Australian national team beat the United States in a scrimmage in 2019, which caused pandemonium for ball-loving Aussies everywhere. It was their first win, of course, against the US in 50 years. They'd always had a good product on the courts. When you've got 9 players in the league, which, by the way, is the second most behind Canada, and one of them as an all-star, then you're doing pretty well. But despite all that, for many years, the NBL was quite dead. From the decline in international basketball TV viewership from the end of the 90s, the league's popularity dropped drastically, enough to where 30 teams went bankrupt. Up to as late as 2014, they were bringing in crowds in the 800s. They were flailing financially with an expiring television deal and the least amount of interest ever. It got to be so bad that Larry Kestelman, the owner of one of the teams, Melbourne United, was able to buy a controlling interest, which is 51%, of the league for $7 million. And that's Australian dollars too. So basically it was actually about $4 million in the US. So basically Mike Conley could have bought it about 7 times over with the amount of money that he made last year. Yes, it was a struggle. When Kestelman tried to negotiate a new deal with an Australian TV station, he was literally laughed out of the door. He eventually negotiated a deal with another platform, the Australian Fox channel, that streamed all the games live, and then made changes from within, pouring in money for advertising, entertainment, league regulations, and digital media deals, striving to make it a whole and wholesome experience for Australians to enjoy. About 30 million Australian dollars later, and the NBL was able to cash in on a deal with ESPN on primetime for 59 games, as well as one with Facebook to stream 75 games through their Watch platform. Their aggregate attendance rose rapidly, increasing 32% from Kestelman's purchase to 2019, before LaMelo Ball and RJ Hampton even made their appearances. The league that was bought for $4 million now had a singles franchise sell for $10 million Australian, nearly $6 million for a team instead of the $4 million that was bought for the entire league. Okay, now we're caught up a little bit in the history of the Australian NBL, and we know where they're coming from when making deals with the 18-year-old ballers who don't have checks yet. It's not a phony league at all. In fact, it's still growing largely. You see, the major business plan behind the NBL's growth is by involving popular figures, similar back into the 1990s, where the Dream Team and Michael Jordan captivated the world. Of course, such a strategy could easily implode, as evidenced by the NBL's fall-off as the NBA's influence internationally dropped off after the retirement of the Chicago Michael Jordan. So instead of latching on to figures that aren't associated with them whatsoever, Larry Kestelman and his team are bringing the figures to Australia. Enter Andrew Bogut, Australia's most popular player since Andrew days and before Ben Simmons. After being waived by the Lakers in 2017 after breaking his leg with the Cavaliers, he was enticed to sign with the NBL as a way to stay in Australia and with his second son who was recently born. And also the chance to play with a quote, historic franchise. The Sydney Kings, the team he signed with, was very likely his LA Lakers or Chicago Bulls team growing up. And the NBL fully capitalized on that childhood charm. They didn't just offer Bogut a contract. No, in order to sweeten the deal, they offered him 10% ownership of the team after 2 years of playing, and possibly up to 50%. Now, you're not gonna do that with any normal player. Even if it was within the rules to do so in the NBA, there's no way that you give any player any type of ownership stake for a contract, let alone 10%. And don't even think about half, unless you're truly integral to the league, like game-changing. The only example that I could think of even being conceivable for 10% of the entire franchise are Magic, Jordan, and maybe Kobe and LeBron. That's how rare something like this is to happen in a professional sports league. But the NBL is doing things differently. Their number one priority, as stated by Kestelman, is visibility. The more, the better. For the most recognizable player on the continent, you're gonna want to keep him associated with your basketball league. Meaning that even after he starts dwindling in player value, of which, by the way, he still got plenty of, he was able to win the 2018 MVP and Defensive Player of the Year, he'll still be largely associated with the Sydney Kings in the NBL, which is a huge thing when you're still trying to win over as many fans as possible. So far, the strategy has worked splendidly. The average fan attendance was the highest in league history. Bogut's Kings saw a 50% boost in crowds, and all the digital engagement metrics, which they call the stats of the future, went up nicely. When Andrew was offered the 10% ownership stake, it doesn't mean nearly as much as one in the NBA, of course. American teams are worth some $2 billion, and compared to the aforementioned $6 million, Australia is cheap. Like pennies. The great thing about it though is that the NBL knows this. They're using their relative affordability to open a gateway for other NBA figures to be involved in the league. There are a lot of people who have played for the NBA, and many of them have earned salaries that put them well within the American top 1% wealth brackets. But in relative terms, those are still singular dollar bills when trying to make significant organizational moves. Shaquille O'Neal is one of the league's richest individuals. He made about $300 million from his playing career alone and is doing very, very well post-career, probably making more money than he ever did when he was playing. And he's valued at about $500 million and has the only player ownership stake in the league, excluding Michael Jordan, the only sports-centered billionaire in the history of the modern world. While Jordan owns most of the franchise, it was at a robbery price. In 2010, Jordan was able to claim 97% of the franchise for $180 million, the main investment of which made him the richest former athlete, with a majority stake in an asset that's valued at about $1.3 billion. Shaq came in about 3 years later, buying a minority portion of the Sacramento Kings. And when I say minority, I mean that. He owns anywhere from 2 to 4% of the Kings, and it costed him anywhere from $11 to $22 million. And that was all just for some marketing deals and a cameo at the slam dunk contest. I can guarantee you that he doesn't have a say in player operations or anything of the sort, especially given his comments in the past years as an owner.
Has your boy shaved yet?
Shave what?
Harrison Barnes said he's not going to shave.
Who?
Harrison Barnes said he's not going to shave.
I don't even know who's that.
He's in it for the revenue, I can assure you that. So what about the players that actually want to own and be involved in something? Back when Shaq bought the Kings about 7 years ago now, they were valued at $525 million. Now, the value's just about doubled, meaning that if you want to own 2 to 4% of a franchise, you'd have to pay around $20 to $40 million. Just have your own little slam dunk thingy, bro. And if you wanted any type of say, well, let's say that's around 10% like Bogut is. Well, then you gotta find $100 million lying around. The relatively successful NBA player earns roughly $50 to $100 million in a career. Subtract the extravagant expenses and various investments, and it would be nice to say that they've got about half of that remaining when they retire. Bottom line, if a player like, say, Shane Battier wanted to get truly involved in a franchise, he'd have to look outside of basketball for an option. Of course, that wouldn't be ideal for most of the players who would like to invest and be involved in something. Now, that's where Larry Kestelman in the NBL comes in. With team valuations exponentially lower than those in the NBA, it makes franchises super accessible to any potential former NBA player investors. And when it's super accessible, constantly growing in popularity, and foreseeably profitable, then you've got a product players pay good money, and not ridiculous money, for. That's what happened in 2018 when future Hall of Famer Shawn Marion became a part owner of the New Zealand Breakers for a commitment of roughly $1 million. He'd been looking to turn his experience into some sort of ownership with a club, and he had been looking at sports teams before he was hit up by Matt Walsh, one of the NBL's and Shawn's mutual colleagues. Shortly after that, Kevin Durant himself, with his agent Rich Kleiman, looked into becoming a part-time owner, before concluding that he wouldn't be hands-on enough in a league that's all the way in Australia. However, he's left the door open to renegotiation. For the athletes, former or otherwise, that have the resources though, or the time for attachment, they're signing on like crazy. Just about a year after Marion, Kevin Martin, a 12-year vet that's been out of the league for 3 years, signed a deal that would give him 75% ownership of the newly minted Brisbane Bullets. Not even 3 months after that, a squad of Zach Randolph, Al Harrington, and Josh Childress became significant investors with the Southeast Melbourne Phoenix. Not long after, Dante Exum, an NBA Australian, joined the group. While all of them aren't the most notable players, the only one that most people would know is Randolph, there's still figures in the NBA with that visibility, or at the very least connection to visibility that the NBL is looking for. So, LaMelo Ball. If you're a burgeoning sports league looking for any type of visibility you can get, then it truly doesn't get better than this guy. There's no other plausible scenario in the world that could give you a figure like him. All the people in his popularity range are simply too good for the league. And when I say popularity, I'm talking like LeBron, Steph Curry type popularity. Zion Williamson and Kobe Bryant are the only two figures that could have potentially played in Australia that could rival LaMelo's popularity. Because of him, the league was able to net a deal with Facebook to stream games in North America. They hosted the highest attendance average and highest viewership in NBL history, and perhaps most promising of all, they were able to attract an international audience. For the first preseason game of the Illawarra Hawks featuring LaMelo, there were over 1 million viewers tuned into the NBL, numbers simply unheard of for Australian basketball and probably even Australian sports in general. This was all possible thanks to their Next Stars program, which launched in 2018 as an alternative to college and the NBA's G League, inspired by the drafting of Terrence Ferguson straight out of Australia in 2017. It's essentially a way to broadcast your talents in a way that's accessible to scouts, all the while being paid and solidly developing your skills. Think of it like Luka and Real Madrid, but this is filled with American prospects. The first year into the program, they claimed Bruce Bowen II, a 5-star recruit who went undrafted and eventually signed with the Indiana Pacers. But the second year, they hit the jackpot. RJ Hampton, ranked number 5 in the 2019 US high school class, was convinced by none other than Shawn Marion to choose the NBL over programs like KU, Duke, and the G League. In addition to paying him somewhere around $250,000 or even more, they provided everything he needed to develop as a thriving player. Then, a month later, LaMelo Ball announced that he was joining the NBL as well, and everything, as you guys know, went pretty wild. Thanks to the addition of these two players, the league enjoyed the most attended to game in NBL history, the most watched game in history by far with 1.9 million viewers when RJ Hampton went up against LaMelo in the regular season, and the attention of basketball fans worldwide. The highlights from Melo's 30-point triple-double reached to about 10 million views combined, and their social media metrics went up 400% across the board. According to the reports from the NBL, LaMelo Ball brought $1.4 billion worth of marketing to the league. $1.4 billion. Now, about LaMelo involving himself with the franchise. The Illawarra Hawks is a team that's been struggling now for a past few years and has fallen more and more into debt towards the NBL. As time passed, it looked like it was inevitable that the team would be bought, and likely at the lower end of the dollar scale, given that it's in a smaller market than Sydney or Melbourne. As routine with the previous NBA-affiliated NBL owners, LaMelo and his manager Jermaine Jackson are very likely part of a group that are looking to buy out the franchise, while LaMelo himself is just gonna have a stake in the team, let's say 10%. But of course, unlike the other fringe players or recently retired NBA guys now out of the spotlight, LaMelo shines brighter than any of them ever have. He's already been cast in the spotlight as a revolutionary, whether or not he wanted to, and now, whoever's idea this was, he's continuing that track record. Upon the purchase of the team, he'll be perhaps the only teenager in history that has any portion of a professional sports franchise. And the crazy thing is, he's only at the beginning of his athletic career. Given his potential to be one of the NBA's best playmakers and, if all goes well, players, then his notoriety is only going to rise from here. Somehow. But even if it doesn't, LaMelo is still doing wonders for himself and the Australian NBL. That league is sure to rise in the near future, and whether or not his goal is to profit or simply be involved, it's a complete win. If Sean Marion was able to bring in a 5-star recruit to the NBL in its second year, then what's LaMelo Ball capable of? What will the future prospects of the NBA see in LaMelo's success, and more than likely his encouragement? My prediction, and very likely Melo's group's prediction as well, is that many talented young players, first-round picks, top 5s, lotteries, all that, are gonna come overseas, and likely the Melo's squad. After all, if you're getting paid well, you get to kick it with the man LaMelo who started all of this and still get all the coverage that you're gonna need for the NBA, then why would you be going to college? And as we've all seen, there have already been 2 players in next year's draft class, Jalen Green and Isaiah Todd, who are top 3 prospects, who took the non-college route but went instead to the NBA's G League, with deals that eclipsed $500,000 in total. There's not that much that the NBL can do to contest that, but if anything, Australia was the kick in the pants that the league needed to create stronger deals to retain their domestic talent. Those signings proved that the NBA perceived Australia as true competition, and that's all they could truly hope for. I mean, the big dogs of basketball are considering you competition after just 5 years of remodeling. Again, it all goes back to visibility. With the biggest catch you could possibly get in LaMelo Ball, you now have to involve him internally like you did with the country superstar Andrew Bogut. And that also means involving his connections, of which sprawl all over the world of the basketball elite. When he involves more of those visible figures, the NBL may well be respected as a true alternative league to the NBA, of which attracts the fandom of Australians everywhere. I mean, if your second year of the program brought you $1.4 billion worth of marketing, then what about the years coming up? Not bad for a league that was laughed out of the door. With LaMelo Ball's infamy, Australia could truly become the next huge hub for basketball. Man, and to think that this all happened from a kid who hasn't even been an adult for a full year yet, man, that's crazy!